In the last few decades, public art and education have radically transformed themselves.
They've moved from the fringe into becoming a space in which conversations around the world are occurring.
What used to be thought of as a field with a big object and public space now is something that overlaps with social movements, grassroots culture, online platforms, all kinds of other interesting things.
So now the artists, which was once considered an avant-garde, are now at the center of a very complex, very thought-provoking discussion.
My name is Pedro Lash, and I'm a Duke University professor and a visual artist.
My name is Nato Thompson, Chief Curator at Creative Time.
And we invite you to join us in this online course that is free, and it is called The Art of the MOOC, Merging Public Art and Experimental Education. In this course, you will make your own social projects as you learn with us and our guest presenters of all of these amazing transformations, the projects, the theories, the ideas, and the players around the world.
And what's wonderful is we have an incredible roster of talent, from artists to curators to academics, who you could never get in the same room. And you could never actually have in a physical class. Online, we can actually have this and galvanize a very historic discussion.
And we will always be challenging you and your peers around the world to be making work along these lines. We're now going to a special place that will highlight some of the things we want you to deal with.
So come on and join us.
Hello everyone, welcome to The Art of the MOOC, Merging Public Art and Experimental Education. My name is Pedro Lash.
And I'm Nato Thompson.
In today's module, we're going to explore the relationship between public art and spatial politics. Public art has always been a great way to understand entire societies. It's through our definitions of the public that we define the relationship between the visible, the invisible, the national and then the international, and all kinds of other things that matter to social groups.
And just to say, it's a very difficult term to define. If you break it apart, public, what is public? Art, ugh, what is art? But that said, public art, if you will, does in fact, the way in which we read through this says a lot about the societies and the world we are in. Some people think of social space, a lot of these play out in social space, however we may construct that. And sometimes social space is harmonious and people are getting along. Sometimes people have competing agendas, but whatever the agendas are in public place also reflect in the art themselves, from the needs of power to the needs of contesting power to different forms of power bashing up against each other in this thing we call public art. And that's kind of the lens we would like to read this through.
So it's kind of by definition a contested field, right?
Yes.
This idea of public art.
Yeah, it is. So perhaps we can start with a case study on our first genre, which we're describing as monuments.
Let's go.
Let's go. So our first case study is a project from 1982 by the artist slash architect Maya Lin, and it's the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, which in a basic sense was a memorial to Vietnam veterans, obviously, that was in the ground in a V shape that had the names in alphabetical order of the 57,661 victims of the war. And the veterans basically could go in there. Now, that memorial, which caused a giant set of debates for a variety of reasons, because of course the Vietnam War is not exactly the most vainglorious war in American history, also had a lot of debate from Vietnam veterans who came and also wanted to contest it. So a gentleman named Hart actually produced a memorial in reaction to that, which was 3 soldiers standing there kind of nobly. And then we find this kind of battle of memorials that took place in American society. Another kind of case study we can go into is also demonstrative of what might be one of the larger traditions. I mean, it's tied to one of these larger traditions called Percent for Art. And Percent for Art is basically where giant capital projects occur and a percent of that money goes to the funding of art. And so you see, in a large part of public art, history is basically these large sculptures that adorn private plazas. So one example could be Jean Dubuffet's Monument of the Standing Beast from 1984, where the city basically took what was considered a very known, very sanctified artist and said, hey, let's make a sculpture of his. He called it a drawing that entered into space.
And Chicago is full of these sculptures, right? Like there's a Picasso sculpture,
Yes.
all kinds of major artists. Calder of the time were commissioned these major artworks.
And it was a way to think through what the city is. And I know that, we live in an age right now where people may look a little like snarky at that, but if you can imagine, it was a way to bring these kind of modernist ideas into the living environment of a city.
In fact, we can trace the history of these types of monuments from what would be the 19th century idea of the civic monument with a hero, often white males who were shown on a pedestal, to the modernist artwork like what Nato described, to the critique of that type of artwork that many of our contemporaries call plop art.
Yes.
So plop art is used as a derogatory term to talk about this type of artwork.
And that being said, the idea also that you would plop it in space, that there's no relation to the site, and also too that it would adorn some sort of space of power in the city. And be permanent. I should also mention that.
Yeah.
Often they were permanent artworks.
Which is in itself something that later generations started to question, this whole idea of the permanence of art, right? To further show how contested these sites often are, we have a few case studies that highlight the contested nature of them. So if you go back to the 19th century model of the civic monument with a hero, etc., we have the Vendôme column, which famously was brought down by the very population of Paris. The Paris Commune decided that the state should not have put this sculpture up. So, Courbet himself, the painter and anarchist, wrote this manifesto, said we should bring it down, and the sculpture was brought down. And there's beautiful images, engravings of people bringing it down with ropes. Yeah. And so this is a really iconic early example. But much later, like Richard Serra was commissioned, a typical site of contestation isn't only the physical site, but the very structures and mechanisms that commission these works. So for example, Richard Serra's Tilted Arc work was commissioned for Federal Plaza, and it was commissioned entirely legitimately by a specialized art group, that said, a panel of experts that said, this is a great artist, we should commission a public art for him. He did the right thing, he made it, but then the people who used that site hated the artwork. Yeah. They thought it disrupted their everyday life. They wanted it removed. Yeah. Thousands of people signed the petition. And actually, that very commission had to say, well, if the public hates it, we have to do something about it. Eventually, it was removed, but Richard Serra started a legal case. So it's become like a case study example for even law debates on public art. The work is no longer there, but because it was a site-specific work, not just a sculpture, Serra considers it destroyed, even though it still exists dismantled somewhere.
Yeah, and just to say too, like sometimes, I just think it's important to also recognize that sometimes the public doesn't like art. And some people would say, oh, Richard Serra's art, it's just modernist piece, it's metal, it just kind of sits there. It's not really public friendly. But the public can also hate public friendly art. Yeah. I don't think we always have to trust the public likes only good art, just to say.
In fact, Serra himself said that, art doesn't have to be pretty or likable.
Or friendly.
Or it doesn't have to be democratic even, right. But of course this is up for a debate, whether public art should be democratic or not. Yeah. As a last example, because it helps show how slippery these things can be, we have the idea of international conflict. So Saddam Hussein's sculpture that was toppled during the early stage of the US occupation, people wanted to represent that as like a genuine, spontaneous uprising of the Iraqi people against Saddam. But later it was shown that it was highly staged, right?
Exactly.
So these international conflicts are often really problematic. Like we shouldn't just immediately judge when a sculpture is removed or attacked, like who's behind, et cetera, can often be a complicated matter in itself.
And I have another example, which is the Cows on Parade, which is a kind of silly example because I don't know any reasonable artists that like it. But it's nice because it's a private, public, artist triad that produces art in the cities. And basically this started again in Chicago, but it was a simple project where there was these cows, the cow being the symbol of Chicago because the cows not only were in the stockyards, but it was the cow that kicked over the lantern that made the Great Chicago Fire. And the cow is basically put in various kind of plazas in front of a Starbucks, in front of Bank of America, in front of Citibank, in front of various kind of corporate entities that allow this thing to be put in front of their building that then they commission an artist to paint the exterior. And the city goes wild. People go check it out. Now this thing is so popular. There's giraffes on parade. There's ostriches on parade. There's
in
kangaroos.
Mexico City we have cactuses, you know. So each
Oh, you
kind
got
of
the
city,
cactus?
yeah, we get the cactus, you know. But you know, it's also trained and untrained artists, right? It's like basically anybody can propose to do a cow, and then it gets accepted or rejected. And you know that also leads us to the idea of the so-called vernacular memorials or monuments. The idea of an individual, a citizen, who says, "I want to have my own monument, not to myself but to something." Okay. And one of the most beautiful, in fact, I would call it a gorgeous example of this, is the Watts Towers in LA. You know, in the Watts neighborhood of LA, basically Rhodia, Simon Rhodia, built these gorgeous towers, and he was a mason himself, so they were built with parts of metal, but also all kinds of found objects that children in the neighborhood would bring to him. And the details are gorgeous, but also the structural stability of these things. He was, for decades, fighting the city government of LA because they thought, oh, you don't have a permission to, so he kept trying to get the right permissions and so on. Eventually, he gave up and he moved, in his old age, and left them there to someone. And then they were going to destroy them, but a group of citizens came to him and said, these are gorgeous artworks and monuments. We have to preserve them. And they had to go through a safety test, even though the foundation only has about 2 feet. Yeah. And these towers are enormous.
I've been there.
They basically use cranes to test the stability, and it's one of the most stable things that any human has ever built of that size.
I love this category, which is the what are we calling this?
It's the untrained artist.
The untrained artist monument thing.
Some people call it folk art, but when it comes to monuments, it is its own category of the monument.
And I feel like every city's got their iteration of that kind of thing. Okay.
And there's as a last
there's more?
Yeah, because every example we've listed, is basically within urban settings. Okay, right? And the large majority of humans do not live in a city, right? Although we are living in that transition, even in China, from the rural to the urban, most people live outside of big cities.
Wait, that's true?
Yeah.
So I didn't know that.
Yes. So why do we think that public art can only exist for those people? Well, it actually is not true. Many artists, but some of the most important ones are called land artists, or they've created what we call earthworks or land art.
Yes.
Thought, actually, no, these kinds of massive or highly public artworks should also exist outside the city, in far removed areas, and the key example of this is an iconic artwork that Robert Smithson did called Spiral Jetty, where he basically built this, it's exactly what it sounds like. It's this enormous jetty built with rocks, etc., and he built it to be permanent, to become something that is visible from outer space. He was very interested in the relationship between not just agriculture and how humans have transformed agriculture, but whatever you can see from outer space, but also post-industrial landscapes, right? Yeah. So Spiral Jetty very quickly became this iconic,
what do you mean post-industrial landscape?
Like Smithson would often explore areas that had been used by a certain type of mining and so on, and thought, oh, can I make an artwork right there? Yeah. And so land artist Nancy Holt, many artists of the land art movement intentionally went far outside of the city to find cool sites and make art for them.
Now, is it me, or did land art often have a real kind of play with the idea of long-term time too? time was a big part of that. And I don't know what it is between the kind of short time of the city and the long time of nature, but it certainly played within the land art kind of aesthetic sensibility.
You know, in our introduction to this module, we spoke about how, you know, spatial politics can deal with the visible and the invisible, the rural and the urban, but it also, you're right, it has to do with the past and the present. So many of these land artists cared about archaeology and its relationship to contemporary art, right? Too many people assume that if it's contemporary art, it can't deal with history, but they were super inspired by Mayan temples, all the Nazca lines in South America, all kinds of other archaeological
You know what's so
sites.
funny about me? I don't know what it is, but whenever I think of land art, it's a bias, but I always think it's like somewhat spiritual art, or like whenever I think of people really into long-term time, I think it's like avoiding political contestation, because of course often the desire to get to the country feels like you're avoiding the politics of the city.
Right.
But land art certainly has some of those concerns in it.
Well, and remember,
problems in it.
And remember that in other parts of our MOOC, we talked about communes, and communes did precisely that in many cases. They left the city to build projects outside of it, right? To, you know, reimagine society. So land artists were trying to do the same. So Nato, especially in the last few decades, public art isn't always permanent, right? What other kinds of public art genres?
Well, so we're going to talk about ephemeral art.
Great.
But also, too, I'd say there's a variety of reasons why someone might do something on a short-term basis. One being, perhaps, if you can imagine, just think about the negatives of public long-term projects. You got to go clean them. They get graffitied. If you're going to have something that's got to last for 30 years, you have to build it in a different way. It's got to be sturdy. So there's just a certain cost and like upkeep question.
Right.
Or you need permits to the site for indefinite amount of time. Whereas ephemeral, you could like say, hey, can we use this space for 30 days? Hey, can we use this space for 60? Or maybe the artist is perhaps wanting to do something that kind of disappears, that isn't object driven. Or perhaps on another level too, sometimes the artworks speak to the political kind of questions of that particular time. And though some people think great artworks need to speak to political issues for all time, there is a different opinion, which is some works speak to a particular moment in time and then it disappears.
And then also, you know, sometimes the artwork is supposed to be in different places, right? While there's site specificity and often monuments have been associated with a particular location, sometimes the artwork, you know, wants to travel as much as the artist wants it to exist in different settings.
Yeah, there's a whole variety of reasons, as you might well imagine, of why someone might work that way, and also the advantages and disadvantages of working this. So we're going to talk about that in this particular section. So let's go to a case study. So in terms of ephemeral events, we thought we'd kind of move this along the kind of trajectory of super short term and then extend that kind of time frame out, because at the end of the day, humanity itself might be a temporary art project. It's just the time frame is different. So like, you know, in terms of the first one we're going to go with is Saiwo Chang's explosion events. And this artist, Saiwo Chang, basically uses fireworks, the gunpowder, you know, in terms of like gunpowder as a material to produce these elaborate displays of like boom, 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 boom at night. And he's done fireworks that are like black fireworks during the day that streak across the sky to a circle of fireworks that blow up at once. This is a kind of what you might call an ephemeral, super ephemeral, short-term thing.
But it's also something we would call properly monumental, right? Because they're enormous.
So, in terms of scale.
So they're still monumental, but ephemeral.
Yeah, and they are political, but it's a little less, I kind of think of these a little more poppy. You know, the politics are more subtle than some of the other stuff we might discuss. So then we have another project by Nina Kachadorian, Stephen Masson, and Mark Tribe called Car Park from 1994, which is a very fun, sweet project where they basically took a parking lot at a school at Chula Vista, Southwestern College in Chula Vista, and they decided to color code the entire parking lot. So students would come in and they would be like, white cars over here. Okay, yellow cars, you got to go to this section. And so it was a kind of participatory short-term work.
And it's also, I think, a very nice example because we were talking about land art before and this notion that great contemporary art or public art doesn't always have to happen in the city. Well, few people would have expected that a great contemporary artwork would happen in Chula Vista, right?
Yes.
With students driving their cars. But here it is, right? Yeah. So these types of artworks, the ephemeral ones, often challenge the very, associations we have with the more permanent type of monument.
Well, and as we go through time, I think one of the things you find is a lot of the early public art was really stuff that came out of a studio practice for galleries or museums and then found their way into the world. Right. Whereas Car Park clearly is using the vernacular materials of everyday life as material itself. So the car, parking lot, not only the place, but the materials.
And this takes us to another reason for why many of these artists did not want to make the more permanent object-based type of public art, and that it has to do with its market circulation, right?
Right.
These artists often wanted to defy capitalism, the market, the idea of these big commissions. Instead, they wanted to do something that intentionally, would not participate in that type of market culture, right?
Yeah.
And as one of the formulations of that, well, so far we've talked mostly about large public art, whether it's ephemeral or more permanent. There's also the idea of an individual or a small group of people intervening in public space and making art that way, right? We certainly can call that public art. And so, as one example, we have the artist Sophie Calle, who collaborated with the quite famous author of novels and other texts, Paul Auster. They had this ongoing relationship over the years where he would create characters for her in a book, and then she would create an artwork in dialogue with him. And so they called this series Double Games. And for one of them, he actually wrote this character for her, and then she enacted it in a public space in New York. He basically said, you should take over something that is highly public and just make it nicer for people and engage with them on an everyday basis. She decided to choose a public phone booth, right? One of those we don't have anymore because we use cell phones.
I've heard about them.
and so,
now every time I see them, I'm like, are you making a drug deal? No, I don't know.
So she basically, people perhaps thought she was homeless or something, but she decorated this phone booth with very private items, and then she would engage with people on an everyday basis for a couple of minutes of each day for quite a long time. So it's this idea not only of the individual in space, but not permanence, but duration. You talked about time before, right? But so many of these artists, not only do they want to do something in public space and public time, but also the idea of repeating, of coming back to a routine.
And just to say too, these definitions that we have are very fluid. So certainly within this ephemeral thing, you have performance, which intervenes in the public space. So Adrian Piper had a project from 1970 called Catalyst One, where she rode through rush hour in a rush hour subway in clothes that she'd soaked in vinegar, eggs, milk, and cod liver oil. So it just became this kind of grotesque smelling person on the train, on the subway, but also began, through this project, basically intervened in a kind of psychology of space. And what's really important about her early performance work that I think is important for us to think through too is not only is space loaded in terms of money and finance, but also through gender and through race, and that all of these things are already happening. And sometimes artists, by either performing or even sculpture or whatever, are basically highlighting the nature, making us aware that these kind of forces are working in the public
And
sphere.
also through the senses, right? In this case, particularly smell, right? Through this Adrian Piper intervention. And a theorist who has been very influential, not just to the artist, but to many other people who think about space, is Henri Lefebvre, a French thinker who wrote this book called The Production of Space. And in it, he argues something that is certainly, it applies to most of the cases that we've studied so far and will study in this module. And it's this idea that space isn't just something we can take for granted. It is something that is produced just like sausages are produced or cigarettes are produced. Space is produced by us as societies, and it's different depending on what society we're looking at, right? So many of the artists who we're studying basically want us to put attention on how space is produced. Not just that it is there, but how it is produced.
And it's interesting too because, often I just find too, Lefebvre's always really interesting, and working in public art's interesting because the spatial dimension is always a valuable tool when thinking through most classic political issues. If you talk about race, but you talk about the politics of space as it applies to race, it's a very different kind of concern because often the conversations of race focus on representation, image, body, visual, but the spatial dimensions, how cities are constructed or how people move through space, or how gender is constructed, through space, how people move, how patriarchal dominated space can be.
Well, in many subways around the world, actually the very trains are divided by gender, So this is definitely something that feminist theories have also written a lot about. One thing we haven't highlighted yet, we talked about the idea of repetition in time, right?
Yeah.
The idea of reoccurrence, but it's worth here highlighting the idea that memory is connected to not just monuments. With memorials, it's obvious, right? But in general, memory, public memory, is highly associated with monuments and with public art, right? Some artists have decided to address that not by making something that is in a space that we anoint as the space that is remembered, but by repeating, by returning to a particular event, right? Yeah. So Jeremy Deller did an amazing project, called the Battle of Orgreave, where basically he restaged a famous confrontation in England between police and striking miners. It was a confrontation that became violent. It was iconic for that early neoliberal age of Thatcher and Reagan, right? And he worked with people who were alive at the moment. Often we return to past historical events once everybody is too old to remember or is already passed away, right? Yeah. But Jeremy Deller, through a public art commission, wanted to do this while people were still alive. And they restaged the whole thing to the T, right? Yeah. And it was an amazing kind of public art production.
It's my favorite public art project.
And an earlier example of that probably, for Deller was a source of inspiration, was Ant Farm, who quite radically, a decade after JFK's assassination, to be exactly in 1975, they basically reenacted as accurately as they could the assassination in Texas, right, in Dallas. And they did it several times, so it was running on a loop, right? And a male actor, basically one of the members of Ant Farm, stood for Jackie, So things were clearly wrong, but they also did it so perfectly that it felt right. Over the times that they did it in the day, it grabbed more and more of an audience, and very strange reactions. There's a great documentary that shows people's reactions, and they are just bizarre. Like a woman clapping when the shooting happens, others saying, with their entire family there, saying how excited they were to finally have witnessed it. Yeah. So this idea of repetition and memory is something that we really care about when we talk about
it's fun too. I mean, I have to say, one of the things I love about, we love this particular subject. And what I really love about art in the public sphere too, that it is of this nature, is when you go into a museum, you go into an art museum. And like a classic question most people get in art museums is, why is this art, right? But when you just see stuff in the public sphere, you don't have to know it's art or not. It's just weird stuff in space.
I think a great example to show this is Key to the City, right? Sure. Can you talk a little bit about, that project is about access and lack of access in the urban space, but we can talk about it as art, but also to some extent it doesn't matter whether
it doesn't matter.
Art. Yeah.
This is what I like. So Key to the City is a project we did with Paul Ramirez Jonas, and it's basically, which I like, it's using, again, a vernacular material. This is a key, basically. Now, that every city, not every, but I would imagine most, have a key to the city, where they typically give it to dignitaries, like the Dalai Lama comes to visit, they're like, hey, Dalai Lama, get a key to the city. And it's actually meant to be like, from the Roman period, where you literally had a key to the city. So, it's a big deal, but now it's just kind of ceremonial. So Paul Ramirez Jonas' idea was that the key would literally become a key that everyday people could have. And that the key wasn't just a functional key, so this key literally handed out to 26,000 different people, but it's also an award. A key is an award. So you would literally give it to somebody else in the middle of Times Square. People handed it to each other. And then this key that you would receive, you could open up doors across the city. So it functionally opened up places. So you could literally turn on a light in Bryant Park with your key. You could go to a taqueria in Queens and open the back door and go downstairs and make tortillas with folks. You could go to the Brooklyn Museum, and between two paintings, you could open up a secret door like you're in a Scooby-Doo cartoon, and there'd be a private exhibition for you. So the key became a site of access to the city. And in some ways, demonstratively for this, the key, that project, Key to the City, also is kind of what public art can do for spatial politics, in so much as it shows that there are places that you cannot go, there are places that you can.
Right.
There are places you can go that you didn't know you could go. What is public, what is private?
And in this case, his project, focused on the everyday, the immediate, he located it in one city, right?
Yeah.
But there's also artists who have wanted to play with this notion of spatial politics, but in what we would call the macro politics, right? Spatial divisions that are either national borders or actual geographic separations and so on. And I think one of the best artists who's been doing this type of work quite consistently for the last few decades is Francis Alise, a Belgian artist who
everyone agrees is amazing.
Yeah, and so he did, we will only talk about 3 projects very quickly that because they touch on very different physical, cultural, political borders, right? Mm-hmm. In the Green Line, basically, Francis Alise did this project in Jerusalem in 2004. He walked through the municipality of Jerusalem with many cans of green paint. He would just punch a hole into the can of green paint and would walk, attempting to recreate exactly the green line, the separation line between, Palestine and Israel, right? And so this is a very powerful physical, embodied enacting of a political division. Political divisions often only exist on maps, and it's the only way you can test them is by going to those geographic areas to really see if they exist, right? And another project he did that deals with borders is called Bridge Puente, where he, as a project for the Havana Biennial in 2006, he convinced all kinds of fishermen in Cuba and also fishermen in the US, in Key West, to kind of put their boats in a chain so that they would attempt to reach each other and create a bridge between the United States and Cuba, right? Awesome. And many of his projects have monumentality built into it, but also failure.
Yes.
Everybody who was involved knew this was an impossible task, but they still participated, right? Because they thought it was a really cool idea. Because you could actually walk from boat to boat and try to reach and see, are we going to make it, right?
That's a great project.
Another great project he did later in 2008 is called Don't Cross the Bridge Before You Get to the River. And he did it for Gibraltar, that famous area that connects, Northern Africa with Europe. And he worked with all kinds of kids from both communities, southern Spain and northern, in Morocco, And they basically also, through a chain of human beings, of children with little boats they made with shoes and sandals, were trying to reach each other, And it's a beautiful set of not just interactions, but videos and installations that he made. And, this type of public art can make us think whether the public is not just the space, but what we call publics, right? With some of these projects, there's a public that is an audience, but in others, like in the Francis Alise example, the public are the very people who participated.
That's a key thing.
And then the public of the video that saw it in a gallery or something like that,
we could get into the kind of different complexities of audience. I'd also like to say too, just on this subject, one of the important things, I think a lot of people think thinking happens in your head, but I think it's a misleading thing. Thinking can happen in space and time. And bodies moving through these kind of works often are ways that the civic thinks through the world other than debate. And politics isn't just a word thing. Politics can be a spatial thing.
Well, and what better example, and that's our final case study, Javier Tellez, project that he did for Insight, this really amazing set of exhibitions that happened in Tijuana and San Diego, he did in 2005 a project called One Flew Over the Void, where he staged this really interesting parade.
So these are just the hits. You're just getting all the hits. These are amazing projects.
And in terms of physical embodiment and space and politics. You know, Javier Tellez's piece just captures all of it in one nutshell. And it's basically, he created this parade he works often with notions of psychiatry and psychology and critical psychology. And so he works with inmates of different, mental institutions. And in this case, he worked with one in Tijuana, San Diego region. But at the end of it, so they created this parade. And then at the end of it, they had a human cannonball.
Yeah.
And this man flew over the border. And, his body basically crossed international space.
That's so awesome. We should watch it.
Yeah.
Let's watch it.